welcome. I'm really pleased to see you all in this room for such a vital and important subject. At the end, on the last day, at the end of the conference, people are tired, but please pay attention because, you know, it would be good to have your questions and we hope to have a good discussion. I just want to start by giving you some numbers. We're talking about technologies and immigration and what happens at the EU borders and more globally. You probably all remember 2015 and the news dominated by boatloads of refugees and people crossing the Mediterranean and many of them dying and children dying on beaches. And just to give you the numbers, in 2015, when the crisis started, there were about over a million refugees that came into the European Union. In 2019, the numbers have diminished somewhat, 125,000 and 1,000 people died. In 2015, the figure quoted on people dying in these crossings was 3,700 and 71 people dead. And of course, many of them are still lingering in camp in Greece and around the Mediterranean. There's not so much news about this now, so this is why this panel is here now. Has the crisis stopped? Is it continuing? Have they found solution? These are people that are fleeing conflict and various other crises that often are imposed by the West on them. So this is what this discussion about is what is happening globally, what the European Union is doing. And I've got a really expert and most illustrious panel here. You all have their bios in your papers, so I don't need to repeat them. We are going to start with Petra Molnar, who is European Digital Rights Mozilla Fellow studying this issue for us, and she will give an overview. And then Patrick Breyer, MEP, will give the political position in the European Union. Christian will talk about impacts and what's happening in the human rights and privacy and data protection field. And we'll end with my colleague from Homo Digitalis in Greece, who will tell you what's happening in real life on the ground. So, Petra, please go.
Thank you so much, Anna. And thanks to all of you for coming on a Friday afternoon. Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm an immigration and refugee lawyer until very recently based in Canada. What I will do for you today is provide a bit of an overview of what we're talking about when we're looking at new technologies used in migration control. This is a continuation of the work I've been doing in Canada, looking at automated decision-making in immigration and refugee applications. And with my colleagues at EDRi, we are going to be looking specifically at the lived experiences of people who are experiencing technologies at the border and beyond the border as well. So when we're talking about technologies of migration control and management, in our kind of survey of what's been happening, we can break this down into a few categories. And what I really want to do is highlight some of the real costs to people's lives and to their human rights as well. So, for example, we've been seeing increased use of algorithmic decision-making in a variety of applications globally. One of the most stark examples, which is a bit outside Europe, is at the US-Mexico border, for example. Those of you who might be aware, there's a humanitarian crisis, of course, developing there as well, and new technologies are being used to justify the detention of migrants based on algorithmic decision-making. Automated decision-making is something that is increasingly making its way into a variety of decisions normally made by human immigration officers. And the trouble there is that we're importing this type of decision-making into complex administrative decisions that are quite difficult for humans to parse through. And currently, given the lack of governance and regulation, this creates this kind of what we sometimes call a laboratory of technological experimentation without appropriate safeguards and oversight mechanisms. Biometrics is something I think that is a key theme, particularly for the conversation of this year's CPDP. And in terms of migration control and humanitarian management, we're seeing an increase of this kind of experimentation occur in spaces like refugee camps and migratory zones, and even airports and borders. Now, perhaps the infamous border control project, which is essentially, I'm simplifying it a bit, but an AI-powered lie detector that purports to discern whether somebody is telling the truth based on their facial movements and the size of their pupil. And there's the lesser-known similar project called Avatar, which was being experimented with as well. The problem with these kind of technologies, though, from an immigration and refugee lawyer's perspective, is that how can an AI lie detector deal with, for example, differences in cross-cultural communication? I mean, I've represented people for whom it's difficult to make eye contact with a member of the opposite gender because that's culturally inappropriate. But how will we make sure that negative inferences about their plausibility and truthfulness are not made in this type of system? Or even perhaps in a more complex way, what about the impact of trauma and memory? We know it's very difficult to testify or even come up with a linear narrative when you're under pressure. So how are these systems going to be able to deal with something like this? We're also seeing, of course, increased population prediction and surveillance and interdiction, which I know my colleague will talk a little bit about. But this kind of over-reliance on data, particularly by powerful actors like the European Union, against a vulnerable population really begs the question, is more data better oftentimes? And I would say sometimes the answer is no. But really, what I want to do, and hopefully we will get to do this together today, is to unpack some of the human rights impacts and risks to real lives that this kind of over-reliance on technology can mean. And there's kind of 6 main takeaways that I want to leave you with. These technologies are already in use and in development. This isn't just some sort of theoretical thought exercise. We're seeing this happen all across the world, including here in the European Union. And the sheer scale of potential impact is quite extraordinary. We're talking about millions of potential applications and people's lives being affected. The risks to human lives and human rights are real, and this is something that we will unpack a bit more in detail in the discussion, but a whole host of internationally and domestically protected human rights are affected already, including the freedom from discrimination, privacy rights, and freedom of movement. What's particularly interesting, though, about immigration issues is that immigration law is a highly discretionary area with weak safeguards and oversights already. And oftentimes there's also this nexus between immigration law and national security, which makes understanding what's going on particularly murky and difficult to get at. But perhaps most importantly, what I want to leave you with is the idea that this AI hype that we're seeing and techno-solutionism is not an appropriate solution for a complex humanitarian crisis. So why? Why are we seeing this increase of technologies? And maybe I'm going to put on my philosopher hat a little bit. I mean, in my work, what I really try and push forward, of course, is that technology is not neutral. I would hope that this is an established kind of idea for this crowd already. But it replicates power relations in society, and its benefits don't accrue equally. So while conversations around AI and ethics, for example, are increasingly taking place, ethics don't go far enough because we need a sharper focus on oversight mechanisms that are grounded in fundamental human rights, but that are also context-specific. Ones that recognize the particular vulnerabilities of the communities that we're working with. And what's particularly troubling is that we're seeing this lack of governance when it comes to new technologies of migration control, perhaps because migrants and refugees are seen as a viable testing ground for new technologies that are also occurring in spaces like criminal justice and welfare checks. So I think there is a particular appetite for these type of technological experiments to be done in this space, particularly because we don't have a governance mechanism to think through how this could potentially be regulated. So I think I'll stop there, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. That's a brilliant sort of introduction to what we're talking about. Patrick, may I come to you? To use a quote I read recently, throughout Europe, leaders are succumbing to the keep them out syndrome. What are politicians and Parliament doing about all this? Please tell us.
Thank you very much for inviting me and for the question. It's a bit of a new role to be speaking on behalf of the entire EU, because I'm usually a bit more partisan and politically active, but I'll try to do my best. Now, the EU is fundamentally disagreed when it comes to refugees and on how to find a fair way of dealing with refugees. Every country has signed up to conventions and international law that mandates, of course, keeping refugees safe. That basically rests on our historical experience when especially Germany was the cause for people having to flee, and many other countries did shut their borders, and that resulted in death and perishment of uncountable people. And that's why we have international conventions nowadays that guarantee the right to asylum, etc. But that right, of course, means that if it is applied only to the first country refugees enter, and that is the current legal framework in the EU, it means a disproportionate burden for those countries at the border, at the external border, and that results in, the situation in refugee camps in Greece, for example, or in Italy, which are terrible conditions. And the Parliament has actually agreed, or there's a majority position on how to establish a fair regime of distribution of refugees, and Parliament has passed positions on a number of proposals the EU Commission made. But as you all know, the member states, the governments in Council cannot agree, particularly the Eastern European Visegrad countries are not willing to accept any refugees to their countries that didn't enter them directly. And therefore, there is a deadlock on that front. So there is disagreement on welcoming refugees, but there is a lot of agreement in the EU on how to best keep people out. So there are EU rules in place in the Schengen framework. For example, on the documents that you need to carry, biometric documents. On visa, on the information exchange, Schengen information system. There are legal rules in place on compulsory fingerprinting of immigrants from third countries. There are PNR rules in place, so collecting information on all flights to the EU or the other way with the US, Canada, and various other countries. There is a program called Eurosur, which is on border surveillance. So technology is harnessed to surveil borders and deter illegal immigration. The EU has passed a so-called smart borders package, which means collecting information on all people, on all travelers, and using them to profile them even before entering the EU. So using a system that we know from the US, where people are classified in risk categories on the basis of soft data, not on hard convictions or criminal records, but on probabilities, which is highly problematic, of course, and my group has always been opposed to that approach. And finally, a technology that you've already touched upon is one that I've particularly dealt with, which is iBorder Control, a EU-funded project to harness technology at land borders of the EU. And one component in this system is a video lie detector. So whoever wants to travel to the EU would have to answer questions in front of a camera on their laptop, on their smartphones. And the software is supposed to detect microfacial expressions that apparently are supposed to indicate whether they are lying or not. I think it's voodoo science. The research that's supposed to show that it works is not sound. Not reliable. Scientifically, many researchers criticized it. The company involved in the research project is the company that's also commercially selling it, or let's say Manchester University, that's involved in the research project, has a commercial spin-off that's selling the very same technology they have developed. And I think this kind of technology, which doesn't work, results in mass incrimination of people who aren't actually lying. One journalist from The Intercept has been able to test the technology. She answered 16 questions correctly, and she said the software said 4 were answered falsely, which wasn't true. So if you have a rate of false hits of 25%, you can tell that at a large scale how useless this technology would be. It also results in discrimination, because just as with facial recognition, we know that faces of people of color, of different ethnicities, of women, of elderly, are much less well recognized than those of the average white male. And furthermore, the Commission is declining to release information on the project. They're withholding from the public the ethics report. They're withholding from the public the legal report, that have examined the legal framework. They're not telling us about the results. They're not telling us about the lobbying they've done for the technology. And that's why I've taken the Commission to court last year for disclosure of information, because I think we have a right to know, as taxpayers, as scientists who will want to test and replicate those theories, but also as lawmakers who need to know information about these tests to be able to decide on whether we want to use such technology or not, which would require a legal framework and a legal basis to allow for its use. And so that is one particular case that I've been dealing with in the past. And I think it is just an example demonstrating that intrusive control and surveillance technology is often first used on marginalized groups. And in this context, this is migrants. And then it is later extended to everybody. So we have to be very careful to think that it doesn't affect us. Secondly, this example shows that there is kind of a police-industrial complex of intersecting interests of policing, security, but also industry interests in pushing technology and selling technology. You can make a lot of money with technology, with databases, and that's why we call for the regulation of EU-funded research and industry funding. It's unacceptable that the EU is funding intrusive technologies that are even illegal to use by today's state of laws. And finally, the EU is talking a lot at the moment about AI regulation. And I think this example shows that regulating algorithms should not just be about transparency and avoiding discrimination and sandboxing. It's not just about how to use AI, but it should also be about drawing red lines if we want to use AI at all in a given situation. So any regulation must also be about when we don't want algorithms to take or even support decisions. You know, they say on the border control system, it's just to support the border guards' decisions. But what will happen if it decides differently from the system? What consequences can it have? Risk-averse people will always follow whatever the system says and computer says no.
Thank you very much. I draw the lesson that the only agreement so far is how to keep them out rather than what to do when people come in. So, Christian, can I go to you? And maybe you can give us your perspective as EDPS and issues related to fundamental rights.
Thanks, Anna. I think it was today or yesterday that Vice President Shinas of the European Commission issued a warning to Turkey not to open the gates and allow lots more people into Europe. So it's definitely a message that resonates with the new Commission. I'll talk a little bit about what we've been doing at EDPS, but also I'll try and situate it in a broader framework of what's happening to the climate and and how that's impacting people moving around the world and the political situation, and how that's creating a market for technologies. Basically, the sort of political industrial complex which Patrick was mentioning. We did an event in Albania last year at the International Privacy Commissioners Conference on more or less the same topic, and we had the Data Protection Commissioner from Ghana, we had the Red Cross, we had the Fundamental Rights Agency, and so I'm going to try and build on some of the things that we learned from that conversation. I was looking back at some statistics of what's happened in the last decade. The statistics tell us that if you look up the European migrant crisis, the background is 66 million forcibly displaced people from conflict zones, principally in Syria, Afghanistan, the Horn of Africa, of which 23 million would be recognized as refugees. So those are big numbers. Insofar as that's affected Europe, between 2010 and 2013, 1.4 migrants came to Europe and were registered. That doesn't include asylum seekers and refugees. But in 2015, there were 1.2 million asylum applications. If you look at estimates from the World Bank, from the IOM, you'll see anything between 25 million and 1 billion environmental refugees by the year 2050. So what I'm concerned about is that this phenomenon, this political problem, this human rights problem in the last 10 years is going to increase by an order of magnitude in the next 30 years as we start to realize just how bad the environment, how bad a situation the environment is in because of our actions. Second thing, I won't go into detail, but there is a market for migration statistics. There is a huge market for biometrics and automated facial recognition, etc. And that generates a momentum of its own. Once there is a market, then there is a need to sell it. And like the fact that everyone's talking about AI is because they've got products to sell. And politicians like to have a tool which they can say they can deploy and say that they've addressed a problem. What this crisis has meant in Europe is that there's been a proliferation, a steady drip of initiatives to create databases and systems for monitoring and controlling people who move or want to move across the EU's external borders. The previous Commission, one of their key words was interoperability. It was a very big initiative, and I don't suspect it will become less of a priority with the new Commission. They were trying to connect different systems for the visa information system, the Schengen information system, the entry-exit system. Some of these are under construction and not complete. Something called ETIAS, which is the travel information authorization system. ECRIS, which is criminal records information for third country nationals. And the idea was to connect these databases because it would obviously be more efficient. But what was problematic, deeply problematic from a data protection point of view, and still is, and we've written extensively on this, is that they're basically conflating the notion of border management and migration with crime and terrorism, which you hear regularly in the mouths of politicians. Trump and the others, these criminals and terrorists are flowing across the border. That's a fundamental breach of a data protection principle of purpose limitation. Now, the kind of international framework that we're working within, because I'm particularly interested in the fact that these flows of people these were forcibly displaced people who were fleeing conflict situations. And there is a theory that the troubles in the Middle East and in Central Africa and the Horn of Africa have been as a result of climate change, global warming, lakes shrinking, droughts, etc. So, but in the Geneva Conventions, there is it does not consider climate change to be a reason for granting asylum. There was, just this week, there was a very interesting development in the UN Human Rights Committee, which ruled that you can't send a climate refugee back to their island, which may well have been flooded and not exist anymore. It's non-binding, but it is a systemic global problem of law. Now, to conclude, I think we need to start to see data protection within a broader framework of climate justice, certainly social justice, but climate justice. The idea of climate justice is the world is getting hotter because rich countries have been burning fossil fuels intensively for 100, 150 years, but the most intense effects are felt in the global south. Who have not been responsible for these carbon emissions. And so they then flee those unpleasant conditions and they go to cooler countries like in Europe, and then they're subjected to surveillance. So the data protection problem, which is part of a broader human rights problem, is that simply because you're in a position of vulnerability and you've been extremely unlucky to have been born in a country which ends up bearing the brunt of climate change, you then lose you then have a lower standard of human rights and data protection. The problem, just finally, the challenge that we're going to have as data protection authorities is that we look at individual data subjects and whether their rights have been compromised, whether there's been a violation by a particular controller. We don't have the competence to say, and when there is a new proposal like the ones that Patrick mentioned on PNR or whatever, yeah, we judge that on its own merits. But what nobody seems to be doing right now is stepping back and saying, where are we going with all of this? What's the big picture? There's the analogy of a salami slicing. You keep slicing the salami because every individual measure can just about be justified on its own merits in isolation. But when you look, after a few years, you've only got half of the salami left. I apologize to the vegetarians. So I think that's the problem, and I'm sorry to be so bleak, but it's not a very happy subject.
You've made me very optimistic, Christian. Sarcastically speaking. I think there's a lot of issues there to unpack, but before we start unpacking them, and I hope the audience can help us as well. And by the way, if you have any questions in between, please raise your hand. I'll go to our colleague from Greece, and can you give us a feel of what actually happens at the forefront of a country that bears the brunt of all these issues?
Yes. Many thanks, Anna, for having us here today. Well, the EU has already in place a set of databases in the field of migration and border management, and Christian briefly mentioned all of them. Of course, there are some of them that are around a lot of years now, so we are familiar with them, such as the Schengen Information System, the Visa Information System, and Eurodac, the biometrics database for asylum seekers who are trapped at Greece and at Italy, fleeing from war zones and fleeing from political persecution. But these are not the only databases that exist. Over the last 3 years, the EU has adopted more databases that are not so far away from the people you know, because maybe all of you don't know a refugee, but I'm sure you have classmates at university, you have colleagues at your work, and I'm sure also that some of you maybe are UK citizens, so these things matter to you as well. So the entry-exit system is one of these systems, and it will be applicable to almost all EU citizens. Now, we have to be careful because in all of these existing databases, apart from one, the European Travel Information Authorization System, ETIAS, but in all of the others, we have biometric data collection. This means that fingerprints, palm prints, and facial images of all of these non-EU nationals will be included in databases. But we do not stop here, because as also Christian mentioned, now in the spring of 2019, the EU adopted two regulations in the field of, established two regulations creating an interoperability framework between all these existing databases. One of these regulations is in the field of borders and visa, and the other regulation is on the field of asylum, migration, and police and judicial cooperation. And why this matters? Because as the EDPS has stated in its report, this is the point of no return. We have a mega surveillance database that will give the opportunity to law enforcement authorities to search at the same time all these different databases in order to identify people. We don't speak about verification like what is happening with EU citizens when you go to the borders. We speak about the fact that they will be able to match biometric data by searching them on a database. And as if all these were not enough, we have also Eurosur, which Patrick mentioned, thankfully. Eurosur is not a database like the one we spoke already. Eurosur is a framework of cooperation between the various member states, Frontex, and other EU agencies. And we need to be very careful because according to the paper, to the regulation of Eurosur, Eurosur is there to help in order to save people's lives. But over the last years that Eurosur exists, there is high, let's say, negative criticism, if I can put it in a very good manner, from academic and civil society organizations, that this system, the only thing that does actually is to help with cross-border crime maybe, or just to monitor refugee flows. They are not actually helping people to get saved or rescued. And what matters to us the most is this picture exactly, because there you could see the nice logo of Elbit Systems. Elbit Systems is an Israeli company, and maybe you will ask yourself why an Israeli company logo is in an EU drone. This is a drone from the European Marine Safety Agency, EMSA. EMSA does not buy drones, it makes contracts with contractors. The main contractor is CEIIA, a Portuguese company, and the subcontractor is an Israeli company. So you can realize that EU is paying non-EU companies, third country companies, to monitor the EU borders. Also, I would like to highlight that all these EU agencies are not necessarily in a data procession, let's say, mentality. There are agencies that are doing an amazing job, such as FRA, and also there is EDPS, which is a strong ally in this position, but other agencies over the last months have developed very negative reputation as regards issues related to data processing activities. And one of these is Frontex, and Privacy International stopped one of the projects, let's say, actions that Frontex is planning to do on social media monitoring of refugees. And the other is one action from the European Asylum Support Office, EASO, which was also aiming at monitoring refugees at social media in order to predict, let's say, flows related to migration. This action was stopped by EDPS. And finally, to conclude my short statement, we speak about Horizon 2020 programs. And these things are not actually implemented. They are still research projects, but they matter a lot. And I want to be clear that I'm very, very positive when it comes to Horizon 2020 programs. These programs fund universities and help them to be financially stable. But this is the one side of these projects. The other side of this project is that these projects fund security and border management related research, which in reality, as Patrick and Petra and Christian said, does not actually apply with the EU principles we have. So all these systems, maybe later on, will be sold or will be used, the technology acquired and the know-how, for creating, let's say, a nice sale in a third country place. And we have some actions related to the Greek, let's say, Horizon 2020 project that are related. These are fold out, trespass, eye border control, and border and smile. And we have also done something related to eye border control in Greece. We filed a petition to the Greek parliament, and out of 300 parliamentarians, nobody cared. So we were really unhappy because we failed. But in reality, we didn't fail, but because we saw that Patrick Breyer, Sophia Intveld, Judith Sargentini, and other members of the European Parliament actually asked questions about this project. So it's not us that we failed, it's the Greek politicians that failed to follow on this important project and to ask the related questions to the government. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much for this enlightened comments. I have a follow-up question to each of you, and then I'm going to open up to more wider discussion with our colleagues here in the audience. Petra, you have more global experience and you've seen some of the issues highlighted on the European level. Are there any global discussion, any global solutions that you see coming up, or is it something that passes the buck to technologies all around the world?
Thank you, Anna. I think we're still at a point where what is occurring could be described as responsibility laundering, or maybe in less eloquent terms, passing the hot potato back and forth. Because I think right now, at least in the work that we have been doing, there's a lot of appetite for experimentation in this space, like my colleagues so eloquently highlighted, without an integrated effort to govern the use of this technology, both from a local, but also a regional and an international perspective. And part of this is, I think, the key role that the private sector plays in all of this, and the fact that public entities and private entities, of course, have different responsibilities when it comes to the implementation of new technologies. But I guess it's a bit of maybe a broader question that we need to ask ourselves, and that question perhaps should be, are there red lines that we are not comfortable with when it comes to the rollout of this technology? Perhaps we can conceptualize the use of, AI and AI-driven technology for a particular type of visa applications. We all cross borders, and we know that sometimes these processes can be cumbersome. So, a tool that can help you maybe get your spousal sponsorship processed faster seems like a good thing. But on the other hand, what about when we're playing around with automated decision-making in refugee determinations? Are we okay with that? These are kind of, from the more, again, philosophical perspective, these are normative questions that we have to ask ourselves. It's a world-building exercise. What kind of world do we want to build, and what are we okay with? Particularly when we know that this technology has really far-reaching impacts on people's rights and lives. But then also their ability, to act as an agent and a fully formed human being. That's something I think that's missing from the conversation. Even this conversation right now, there are missing perspectives that we are not engaging with. The fact that, diversity could be greatly improved at this conference as well, let alone representation of refugees and people who are on the move in this conversation.
Thank you very much for that. I think your last point will put back to the conference organizers. Patrick, you mentioned red lines, and Petra mentioned red lines as well. Can you expand a little bit on how you envisage this red lines in the context of technologies at the European borders and the use of them?
Well, basically, it's about who should decide whether someone may enter the EU or not. Should it be an algorithm, or should it actually be people taking the decision? And the thinking of the latest EU databases that we have seen is that you should use risk values or statistical probabilities to evaluate people. And that basically means holding them accountable for the country they come from, for their age, their family status, for whether they figure in some databases. And it's easy to be listed in some database if you have been at an event, at a protest which may have involved unrest. If you're engaged politically, you're much more likely to be in some database. And you might even be held accountable for your name. So the US is using no-fly lists just based on names. So if you have the same name as some terrorist or somebody, you'd be blacklisted. And so I think that as a matter of principle, probability values that are not attributed to the actual person shouldn't be used to decide on whether they may enter a country or not. I think that is at the very essence of human rights, that everyone has a right to their case be decided on its own merits. And that should be the case right from the start, not only if you start to challenge an automated decision or algorithm-supported decision in court. And therefore, that is something that we need to think about. Do we actually want to use AI in such contexts, or don't we want to? The latest thing that's being discussed, of course, is facial recognition, especially where it's used for the purpose of mass surveillance. So it's easy to use CCTV images, which are widely captured anyway, and use them to match people in crowds against databases. And as you probably know, there are not only criminals in those databases, but there are many people authorities just like to have an eye on. It's easy for intelligence services to put someone in those search databases. And that's why we are pressuring the Commission to actually propose a ban or at least a temporary moratorium on the use of this technology.
Thank you very much. So, Christian, let's go back to technologies and then open it a bit wider. I mean, you mentioned quite clearly that the EDPS has limited powers to certain things, but just forget, for example, for a moment that you are just EDPS, and let's talk wider. Just taking it back to technologies and the multiplicity of them replacing human control at the border, do we ban certain practices? Do we use ethical guidelines? How do we proceed with the immediate problem before we go to the wider issues of what globally and Europe-wise the political will should be?
Well, I mean, most work takes place in silos, and that's as true for like bureaucrats as it is for even NGOs. So like, I think there's a fragmentation at the moment still between, if you like, the sort of civil liberties lobby, environmental campaigners, and sort of social justice development campaigners, so advocacy. So I think these things need to come together because that's the engine for change. There are we're going to, I think, in the new strategy from EDPS, and Wojciech will mention it in his closing remarks this afternoon. This will be a strategic concern. So, like the notion that you can just expand indefinitely the scope for surveillance technologies, and at the same time diminish the space of unviolated freedom, so where you're not being watched and controlled, and and the fact that this isn't happening evenly, as Petra said, like these technologies are tested on the vulnerable before they're rolled out more generally. It's certainly happening in Africa. You can even see it in schools, like kids are having to have having to look at cameras in Europe as well, but particularly in China and the US, to have their emotions scanned. So that's a tendency which I think needs to be tackled head on. The other thing is, I don't think we should obsess too much about the technology itself. I think the problem is the people who are in control of it and the political agendas. They may not be able to see longer term, they may be just fighting fires, so it's about trying to educate them that there is a longer term concern. The thing about technology is that what we're seeing is, if you look at, for example, I think I mentioned on the stage on Wednesday that the UN Committee on Trade and Development last year published a report where they were basically saying that technology, the way that technology is being deployed, it's increasing inequalities. So you're getting a class of individuals who are in control of the technology and benefit from it, whether it's the state or big companies, and then you get an underclass who basically have the technologies done to them, and that's ethics, I think. It's not something. There isn't a line of law in the treaty which says this should not happen. You have to derive it from principles and values and the Charter. I think there is a hook in data protection law, which is the notion that data processing has to be fair, and that it has to be lawful. And by lawful, that doesn't just mean it complies with the GDPR. It means that it mustn't break any other rules as well. So it mustn't violate rules on non-discrimination and so on. So there is the potential, but I think there's a lot of work to be done to try to bring together the policy agendas and to try to think longer term, because I really think this is going to get worse and worse and worse unless we start doing some proper forecasting.
Thank you for that. So we need to start putting the salami back together again.
Which never happens.
No.
Once it's gone, it's gone.
Yeah, that's true.
Until there's a war.
Eleftherios, you mentioned the lack of engagement by your politicians in Greece, and also generally commercial interests were mentioned on the panel, and the Horizon 2020 research program was mentioned on the. So, a question to you, but to the rest of you more generally. What do we do about the politics in the nation states, members of the European Union? Some of them are away from the borders, immediate borders, so they just build up walls and it's not their problems. What do we do about the industry transfers of interest and money? And most importantly, what we do about how Horizon and EU research deals with these issues, because it's both an ethical and problem there. So maybe you can answer that briefly, and the rest of you can chip in, and then I'll open up to the audience.
Yes, many thanks, Anna, for the very interesting question. I don't think that I have a very clear answer to this, but I believe that when we have to persuade politicians, we have to think about also this narrative that all these refugees are coming and they are a lot of terrorists hiding in these flows of migrants, and we have to be very careful about it. Because what is the narrative? They take a migration issue and they flip it around and they create a security issue. And we have to be very careful and use as much as evidence as we can. For example, Europol has 2 reports, and these 2 reports, one from 2016 and one from 2019, state exactly that there is no connection between migration flows and ISIS terrorists or related terrorist groups hiding in these flows. And this is very important because it comes from Europol. So my answers will be that in order to persuade politicians, we have to fund more research. And the research comes also for EU institutions like FRA, who does a very good job, but is very severely unfunded. If we look at the EU budget from 2020, you can see FRA, and it has a very low budget, and agents like EASO, like Frontex, it's very huge, like ENISA, and other agencies are getting more and more money and more stuff. And also we need more research, as you said, in Horizon 2020 programs. But we have to make sure that universities have in place specifically, let's say, guidelines on with who they collaborate and they share their expertise, with which players of the industry. In RoBorder, the National Ministry of Defense is involved. How can we expect that the results from such a project will not be used in the defense industry if the defense ministry itself is involved in the research. And some of the universities have taken this very seriously, and they have committees that they check with whom they collaborate. Others don't care because it's a lot of important money that help them with their studies. And I know I didn't answer, but...
Yeah, thank you. Anybody else on the panel would like to comment on these specific issues, the research that is funded? Patrick, yeah.
I think at the core of the problem is at the problem of the national state level is a narrative of fear. There is a surging narrative of us versus them, an authoritarian thinking, a nationalist thinking. That's on the rise. I think Trump has already been mentioned. Johnson, you could mention Orban or Poland and other similar countries. And basically, we need to discuss what kind of society do we want to live in. One that is closed and top-down with authoritarian leadership, with clear cut orders and sort of elitist, like they know best what's good for everybody. The person is not worth very much. Or do we want to live in a society of trust that is based on mutual trust rather than a general distrust, that is based on cooperation? And I think that in the past, societies that sort of switched to the distrust model often had no future and collapsed. Because that is the fabric of humans interacting with each other, a general trust in each other. That's the basis of society, also of economy, and that's why I think a model of general trust and cooperation is the future-proof and the right model. So we'll need to discuss this narrative, and we'll need to also discuss the causes for this narrative of fear, particularly the police-industrial complex that you have addressed. So since I'm a member of the Pirate Party, our solution to this is to hack the political operating system, as we say, to rewrite the rules and to make sure that lobbyism is contained. There's an enormous influence of industry interests on politics at the moment. For example, in terms of various expert groups that allocate funds, including research funds, but also on other EU projects. That's a way for the industry lobby to influence. There are many more ways, like rotating doors, etc., but I can't expand on that right now. And on the other hand, upgrade the people's power and influence on politics, which is, I think, a root cause for why people don't have very much trust in the EU at the moment, because they don't have much of a say, and they don't really have the impression that the average person matters very much to EU policies. Maybe it's rather, yes, particular interests that appear to matter more. And so that's what I think, that's how to counter the influence of the police-industrial complex by, yes, upgrading the people's say and containing the influence exerted by lobbyists.
Thank you for that. Christian, I have a specific question to you, because you mentioned the future, climate change and millions of people being displaced. Just to play devil's advocate for a moment, you might have lots of people in Europe saying, well, there is a human rights question, but there's also a resources and infrastructure question, European health services, European education facilities. How, regardless of the policies and the technologies, how can you reconcile this potential vast increase in population with the resources that can be put forward? Because that's an argument that's used was used a lot in Brexit, for example. And that's partly why a lot of people voted the way they did. So what would you say to them?
It's easy question. I'll kind of slightly dodge the question by
Okay.
there was a novel published last year by English novelist called John Lanchester called The Wall. I don't know if anyone's heard of it, but it kind of it imagines this sort of dystopian. It basically takes Brexit to its logical conclusion, and imagines a kind of Britain after some sort of climatic event. It basically has to build a wall around the country so that no one goes to the beach, no one sees the sea, and children have to, not military service, but they have to patrol the wall for several years of their lives before they enter adulthood. And their instructions are to shoot anyone who attempts to climb over the wall, penetrate the wall. But if someone manages to get over, then they're basically turned into slaves who work the fields. So that's the kind of dystopian vision. What can be done? Well, the other complication is I'm really straying off my brief here. So EDPS people in the room, please don't report this. But I kind of see the climate crisis as like total war. I think that's where we're heading. But it's worse because in the Second World War, basically the whole of society had to come together and work against a common enemy. Whereas the thing about climate change is that it doesn't affect people equally. And so you could get to a scenario where the people who are able to basically keep themselves cool, because they've got the money to do it, they will do so, and then you will, and there won't be solidarity. So I think the challenge now, trying to bring it back to data protection, is that we have to really insist on the fact that it's data protection rights for everybody, and that equally protected, whoever you are, whatever your position of vulnerability is, no matter what suspicions you might be under for doing whatever. And that's where we rely on MEPs and the Commission and the Council to sort of take. When they're looking, they'll be looking at proposals in the next 5 years to protect our European way of life or to manage migration, and they need to draw the connection between that and the sort of fragmentation in society, which has led to sort of simplistic solutions to complex problems like Brexit.
Thank you very much for that. Can I open it up to you? Do you have any questions, comments, more questions? I think there's a microphone there. I don't know if anybody volunteers to take it around or you want to stretch your legs. Oh, there's another one at the back. Anybody? I think we silenced them all. No? No questions? Yeah.
Sorry, I seem to be asking so many questions at this conference. I'm Shankar Narayan from Seattle, also having been an immigrant rights advocate. I'm interested, some of you mentioned automated decision systems being used in immigration in Europe. I'm just curious as to whether you can speak more about that, which systems are in use, how much transparency has there actually been around the systems? Have you been able to actually examine the decision-making criteria? Are they set in statute, or are they sort of internal secret sauce of the manufacturer, and the role of human review in the whole process?
Thank you for this question. Shall I take another one, and then we can go back to the panel?
Hello, Tobias Morschus from Datenschutzraum Germany. My first question, Christian already answered before I asked it, because so I skipped to the second question. My question is, if I look at these data-intensive users, especially in the border program and so on, I ask myself, is that what exactly was the reason for making human laws, human rights to protect any actor from being so powerful to detect everybody anywhere, so that this power is never centralized in any way, and now it looks like this is exactly what we do, and we are talking about safeguards and some political, is it to the law, but I think this is the very essence of the human rights. Is this true? Is it not true? It's my question.
Okay, thank you very much. So we start with the first question, which will be more details on what technologies are deployed and how they are used. Petra, or who wants to? Yeah, you know about that.
Okay, I'll take a crack at this one. So I haven't done much work yet on the automated decision-making systems in Europe, but a lot of the ones that are being thought about follow a very similar model that Canada has been pioneering, and we wrote a report on this last year, which I'm happy to circulate for those of you that are interested. But essentially what we're talking about is, and I'm simplifying it a bit, but it's a triaging model of basically a variant within a subset of the immigration system, particularly for visa applications and applications for temporary residence. So the Canadian model focuses on two source countries, India and China, partly because those are some of the largest source countries for temporary visa applications. In the UK, there's an analogous use where essentially the Home Office has been using a visa triaging algorithm as well. And there is a brand new legal challenge on the books as of November of last year. An outfit called Foxglove Legal has brought a challenge to the discriminatory nature of this triaging. So I think this also begs the question, I think we're entering into a new kind of arena where lawyers are going to start thinking creatively about what to do regarding this kind of at least partial augmentation of the decision-making that occurs when a human officer makes determinations around whether or not somebody should be admitted to the country on a temporary or a permanent basis. But a lot of this is still very much in development. And I mean, so those are the things that occur kind of after you already enter a country. But as we've been discussing, a lot of this automated decision-making occurs, before you even enter at the border and then beyond the border as well. So that's maybe sometimes a helpful framing too, to try and parse out what is or isn't happening.
Anybody wants to add anything on technologies? Robots, drones? Yeah?
Yes, it's not related to automated decision-making per se, but let's say there are algorithmic tools used in Eurosur, for example. Let's say that we have a vessel, and this vessel carries some immigrants and refugees, perhaps, and these people are trying to use the systems in order to predict, let's say, where this vessel will end up, in which shore, based on the existing geographical location of the vessel, the current weather conditions, the Mediterranean water flows. So these systems help the people behind the system, Frontex and the national authorities, to have an idea about where this vessel will end up in order to rescue and in order to send, let's say, border guards to collect these people. So it's not the automated decision-making, it's just let's say, an assistance to the decision maker. Apart from that, yes, I totally agree with Petra.
Okay, so Christian has asked me to give him a minute. He's looking for something online to answer your question. Patrick, do you want to start on that? If not, are you nearly there?
Sure, yeah. I fully agree with the person asking the question, is also a good friend of mine. So the very essence of privacy is not just about the individual person, but it's about the power balance. And the person who knows a lot about you actually has control over you. It was Cardinal Richelieu who said a few hundred years ago, you know, if only give me 6 lines of the most law-abiding citizen, and I'll find something in them to hang them. And so definitely this mass surveillance shifts the power balance. It's no longer the government that fears the people, which is the ideal of democracy, but it's the people beginning to fear the government and what might happen if they behave in an unusual way, if they are reported for certain criteria or something, right? And yes, that's exactly the essence of the right to privacy, to provide for a space where you can reflect, where you can be free to participate also in democracy.
I don't really have much to add to that, but except that what I often find with when I'm speaking to people from the US, for example, is to cite the fact that the Dutch had a census before the Second World War, and that included the like religion, yeah, and that census data was used in order to find who to round up for Auschwitz, for the concentration camps, Jews. So that then, when they formulated the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that was at the forefront of their minds, the fact that collecting all of this data in itself can constitute a risk, a threat. And then, you know, my wife's from Poland. She remembers growing up in communist times, and the fact that there were informants everywhere. Like even her uncle was like, you know, telling the authorities about her father. It was you know, ubiquitous, and that's something which people who've not had to live in authoritarian regimes may not quite appreciate.
Thank you very much. I do appreciate it, because I come from one of those regimes as well. We have 4 minutes left. It's okay. I'll very practically, can each of you, in a very practical way, tell the audience and us, what would you like to see done in the very near future, at least as a first patchwork, before we start tackling the big, really big questions?
Yes. I would like to see more collaborations in the field of NGOs. I believe that there are NGOs focusing on migration law that are at the very stage of where all this is happening, and they can have assistance from digitalized NGO to help with their expertise. And I believe that the European Commission is time to fund more on human rights research. It has to fund more FRA and more research-related projects for human rights implications and less on security.
Petra?
I think one thing that we can practically do is to humanize this issue and to bring in the lived experience, to move beyond a theoretical conversation, one that we're largely having today, and to really think about how this is affecting real people. And particularly when it comes to, you know, their foundational rights, but even just their ability to live a full life of dignity, and even the ability not to participate in a lot of this data collection, which is something that, you know, we were talking about what the parameters of privacy are. I mean, you're seeing this kind of technology rolled out in many different contexts, and a lot of these contexts, as we've been discussing, are ones where there's a power differential, and we need to really be cognizant of that.
Patrick, very practical.
Okay, then I answered the question differently. Very practically, we're advocating a surveillance moratorium, which means no more proposals on bulk data collection and processing, because this really is a danger, a threat to democracy and to the power balance.
Thank you.
Well, the European Commission has got an extremely ambitious policy agenda now, and at the centrepiece of it is the Green New Deal. And I think we're going to engage with that as EDPS in the next few months. But I would encourage everyone to think about how to make sure that there is a human rights component within the Green New Deal, that it's integrated, that notions of social justice are part of that, so that we don't fight climate change simply for the sake of climate change, but because otherwise you're going to have the same sort of tensions that we've seen in France with the Gilets jaunes, where you impose a seemingly environmentally friendly solution which doesn't take into account the fact that there are enormous social tensions and unfairnesses which are being neglected.
Thank you very much. And speaking on behalf of European digital rights, we've got Petra, a very talented practitioner here, who will continue working on this issue, and the EDRi network will work on this issue, and watch this space. There'll be some really good solutions coming up. Thank you very much all for your participation, and please raise your hands for the panel.